as we continue with lessons and inspiration from his original mail order correspondence course called the Yogoda Lessons. My name is Nayaswami Hriman, and I'm talking to you at this moment, at least live, from the Camano Hermitage on Camano Island in western Washington, United States. Today's lesson is a very complex one. It's called Spiritualizing and Transmuting the Creative Force. Nowadays, we would call that sex. But it's a complicated topic because, unlike nervousness or anything to do with attitudes or meditation, memory, the concept or the discussion of how to deal with the creative impulse, the impulse towards sexuality, the expression of sexuality innate to the human form and consciousness, very much depends on whether you're young or old, married or unmarried, what your own attitude is. It's a very different topic, in other words, from most topics when we're speaking of spiritual consciousness. At the same time, it's obvious to pretty much anyone just how central our relationship to sexuality is in terms of that consciousness, in terms of the refinement of consciousness that transcends selfish motives, transcends habits and addictions towards pleasurable experiences or fantasies or images and so forth. You know, it's interesting that so much of what constitutes sexual consciousness really is less anything physical for most people. Let's face it, you can only engage in sex as a physical act, how often? But it's largely up here, isn't it? You know, the images of beautiful people, of, dressing in certain ways, behaving in a flirtatious manner, or observing with admiration or enjoyment, those who do so, like in movies or in novels. And so much of what we're talking about is only somewhat the physical act of engaging in intercourse, okay? It's a very complicated topic, and in the lesson, it's further complicated by the fact that Yogananda addresses relationships between, he spoke of married people, and I'm just going to stick with that because it's just simpler. The relationship between a man and a woman in the married life. He talks about how to attract a noble soul if you're planning and desiring, if a couple wants to have a child. And he talks a little bit about those in the unmarried state. It's really quite a lot is packed into here. He admits the simple fact of our sexual impulses and procreative impulses as well. He decries the kind of shame that particularly in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century in which he lived, the sort of Victorian or Puritanism of his time, and it's not just in the West, it also exists in the East, that sort of suppression and shaming only, as we now know, only compounds the issue of dealing creatively and wholesomely with that impulse. He talks about, naturally, from the yogic standpoint, of when there is arousal that you would prefer, would like to transmute, would like to sublimate. He talks about a very time-tested technique that if there's not too much arousal, but just hello, a little crow flew by, a little bit of an arousal that you are still in control of and you wish to transmute it, use the breath to first focus on that area of the genitals wherever the arousal is felt. It, I suppose, could be in the heart too, but he just called it the Cox Eagle area. and then inhale and draw the feeling, the energy of that feeling, up through the center of the body, up the astral spine, and hold it. Well, you're also inhaling, of course, if I didn't say that, and hold it for up to 25 breaths, as if to refine and purify and dissipate the heat. He didn't use the word heat, but the heat of that arousal, and then exhale and be free of it. And I would say that you're going to need to do that probably more than once. There comes a point, though, I remember Swami Kriyananda saying that when the arousal becomes intense, well, then you may need to jump up and go for a run or take a cold shower or something a little bit more vigorous, as it were, to redirect that energy. Okay. He often mentions in his writings generally, but in this lesson too, that one of the consequences of overindulgence, again, speaking of, let's say, married life and frequent indulgence in sex, is boredom, which is quite curious, although not very surprising, really, if you even think about it. But boredom as one of the downsides, as well as impacts on our health, our nervous system, or the sort of grossness of our consciousness. He speaks about vulgarity in jokes and attention to anatomical details when speaking to others. But in any case, that boredom, the impulse, the desire for sex, isn't all that much different than the impact and so forth of alcohol or drugs, or even for some people eating and sugar, and maybe for a few people stimulants so far as coffee, though I don't endorse that particular view. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that it's intoxicating. And much of the intoxication has to do with the anticipation or the fantasy or the imagination. It's not always so much in the actual experience. But in any case, boredom results when, I remember a cartoon I saw when I was a young man, a boy, always looking at these dirty pictures like young boys do, I guess. And I remember one in which there was a couple in bed having sex, and the woman was reading a book. And as a young boy or a young man, whatever, I thought, oh my goodness, you sort of imagine that having sex was just the greatest thing on the planet. And this cartoon depicted this woman reading a book. She was bored. And in other words, your mind can be a million miles away, even in the actual act. It can be fantasizing about a different, perhaps preferred, imagined partner, or it can be about office work or any number of things. The point being is the intoxication is still not enough, as it can be when we're in deep meditation. The joys, the pleasure of the indulgence in any of the senses, including look at, a beautiful face, for example, or just anything. Any overindulgence, it can't last. And not only can it last, but our consciousness is not as wholly committed to it. It can detach itself from that. That's one of the principles behind Jnana Yoga, behind some of the practices in Tantra, which is that you engage in something that ought to overwhelm the senses, that most people consider do, but in fact you can prove to yourself that you can remain untouched by it. And so partly that is where the boredom comes in. It's an intoxication of the mind only, not of the soul, not of the spirit. It cannot satisfy the union that the spirit seeks. Okay. He talks about couples desiring children, and his advice always runs along, in other writings too, runs along the lines that a couple, a high-minded, noble couple seeking to have a child of spiritual consciousness, of noble ideals, should refrain from sexual relations for about 6 months or so, should keep their consciousness, especially as it relates to one another, here at the spiritual eye. They should, keep their thoughts and their actions and touch and stuff between the two of them is very centered and so forth, because that energizes the magnetism, internalizes and increases the magnetism, the refined magnetism of their own consciousness, because Yogananda says that at the time of conception and union of the couple, those souls who are seeking, whose time it comes to come back, if they are refined and noble, they will turn away distastefully from the vibration of a couple who are in intense passion and seeking the experience merely for pleasure, let's say. Yogananda talks about, comes to my mind here, he has adultery originated in converting the means of creating to an end in itself. And of course we just take that for granted in a culture like today in the world, that of course the pleasure of sex, it's its own reward, it's its own purpose, never mind having children, since we have such effective means of contraception. So his statement doesn't quite fit the times, but Moses gave the law to the Jews long ago and defined adultery as having relations outside of marriage with a married person. Jesus comes along and says, no, adultery is when you even think about it. And now Yogananda is saying that even within a legitimate relationship, a married relationship, adultery is when sex is engaged in for its own sake. Well, oh my goodness, we don't have a clue or a chance in this culture. When I was young and I've started reading these teachings, I remember thinking to myself that the ancient teaching that, especially for the man, sex dissipated his life force, and overindulgence over time would impact his health. I mean, women are affected by the fact of having children and how it affects them and so on, but the teaching more relates to the production of sperm and how much life force and energy that creates. Well, very recently I came across a video, one of those infographics, in which for the first time they described just how much life energy goes into the production of sperm and its reproduction as a result of its being, ejaculated. And so I was heartened to imagine that science, which is the only thing most people believe anymore, and not very many people at that apparently, with the controversies we have in our culture today, but nonetheless, I was heartened to imagine that science is endorsing the ancient teaching, whereas, in some circles, the manliness of men, let's say, is demonstrated by their frequency in engaging in sex, which is actually quite the opposite in terms of the biological and energetic and psychological impacts. You think of the picture of the newlywed husband coming home from his honeymoon just all disheveled. Well, need I say more? Husbands and wives should not discuss their troubles with other people, unless it's a wise counselor and they need help, of course. Married people should refrain from contradicting one another in front of others, or even arguing between themselves, over insignificant things. Let's see. He has another strong statement. He says, the spiritual wife should not forsake the unspiritual husband, and vice versa. They should try to influence and help each other as long as it is possible to do so. There can come a time, and we have seen in the work of Ananda, where the resistance and disdain of one for the other's spiritual aspirations become so great and so mocking and so on that it can be grounds for dissolving their union. Okay. But one should be very careful because people do that. Divorce is now so commonplace as moving your house or getting a new job or a new career. Okay, exercise and dieting. Oh boy, this is taking a long time. Vegetarianism, of course. Sports and exercise, arts, writing, painting, humanitarian service, spiritual service in your, let's say, your church or your sangha. Being actively engaged and creatively engaged. Reading wholesome books. Being very careful about the images that you allow into your subconscious mind. I talked about those in a prior broadcast. So much of so-called entertainment movies have such gratuitous levels of sex and violence that those images, they will stick in your mind. So being careful about what you expose yourself to. Yogananda says that impulses are easiest to capture when they first arise in the mind. And, gazing at an attractive person walking down the street and continuing to gaze, or I forget the word, basking, that's the word. Padma uses this word, basking in the friendly smile of an attractive person who isn't your spouse, is another way of increasing the hold of that attractiveness on our minds. Dirty jokes, as we used to call them. And he says again, remember, overindulgence in sex is a sin in married life. Isn't that interesting? While moderation, mixed with self-discipline and mastery over the creative impulse, awakens the powers of spiritual perception. It's a question of refinement of how you use your eyes and what you look at. Do you look up or do you look down? It's a refinement. It's like when I was a kid, I enjoyed overly sickly sweet candy, let's say. And then as an adult, Well, same thing with sensory indulgence, and certainly especially sex, and of course things like alcohol too, is that what comes with that consciousness is a grossness, a crudeness, and with a more refined, less self-preoccupied, less pleasure-bound and addicted consciousness, a more refined awareness of the beauties of the world, the beauties of people in their souls, meaning in their qualities, not just in their superficial appearance. And then for unmarried people, he really suggests something that amounts to arranged marriages. And I don't mean that literally, nor does he, but what in India are called love marriages are fine as far as they go, but in the West, Yogananda noted even in the first half of the 20th century that a lot of it was superficial. He mockingly called it a pretty shade of lipstick and a handsome bow tie or some such silly phrase like that, meaning they were superficial. And when I look back and sometimes see the movies of those times, you just see how romance, as is still the case, I think, in Bollywood, but in America, the movies, they lived happily ever after, and they drive off in the car with wedding bells, and Yogananda would mock that and say, the next day or maybe the next month, she's got smeared makeup on her eyes and a rolling pin in her hand and curlers in her hair, squalling baby and diapers, the whole bit. So he made fun of that romantic sentimentality. Of course, he talks about the power of meditation, and I don't think I need to emphasize that particularly in this course and with the audience most likely to be watching this. But I do want to check his notes, focusing at the spiritual eye. I talked about that breath technique of overcoming arousal. In other situations, he talks about the former technique that is no longer done in our culture of married couples being in separate beds. Again, these things just don't play in Peoria anymore, but I think in one of his other lessons, not undressing in front of one another, I mean, those things are, just nobody pays attention to that kind of thing. But it all goes to do with the stimulation of the senses, and especially the eyes and the imagination, and of course touch. That he even talks about not, as nowadays in the whole arena of inappropriate behavior, touching, which used to be commonplace and maybe innocent, I don't know, or even hugging, things like that. Our culture is coming around in certain ways to an awareness of how the energies of the physical form can impede or affect us. The transgender movement, at least from the spiritual soul perspective, if nothing else, has for its value saying, I'm not this body. I maybe have a body with a certain gender, but I'm not going to behave in a stereotyped way. I don't want to dress in a way that society demands upon me because of the gender of this physical body. Now, I have other issues with those sorts of things, but I think from the soul perspective, we want to transcend the stereotype and the limitations imposed upon us by nature. One of the issues of that is, can we? Can we not learn at least to accept what nature gives us and the impulses given to us and work with them in a healthy, creative way? I'm not talking about transgender here. I'm just talking about the need to accept what, it's like the game of golf. When the ball lands, you got to play it where it lands. At least you're supposed to. And so accepting what is the true basis for changing to something else, okay? Rather than the tension and suppression and anger and so forth associated with rejection. So this is a complex topic. As I say, age and marital status, all sorts of things impact the utility of talking about the creative force, even though it's everywhere. I remember Yogananda was sitting with the boys, meaning the monks, and talking about such matters with the men who struggled, and naturally, young men trying to become monks. And somebody mentioned one of the monks, I don't think he was present, but that he didn't seem to have much trouble with these impulses. And one of the other monks, somewhat more crude and unrefined in his nature, said, yeah, but he ain't got no energy. And Yogananda sort of chuckled because it is a question of energy. If it wasn't for the impulse of procreation and the attraction between the sexes, we ain't got no energy. And so it's not a bad thing. It's just how to work with it in a wholesome, creative way. I have found, we have seen at Ananda in our communities that men and women, now I'm speaking of not married to each other, well, married to each other too, of course, excuse me, but we can see that men and women can serve together in an ideal goal, serving ideals, in a very creative interchange of their respective points of view and ways of expressing and ways of seeing and ways of acting. Without any of the other overtones and magnetism of a lower variety. So the exchange of men and women in helping one another, especially spiritually, but also in the workplace, is very fruitful. saw an article about the number of CEOs who are female, the introduction of the feminine point of view and consciousness into the world previously and to some extent still dominated by male energy is much needed for the planet. And so this topic is not a topic of shame or guilt or sin. It's really a topic of how to lead a balanced, harmonious, and ultimately a life of happiness and contentment and harmony with your fellows. Okay, big topic, lot to say. I'm sure I could say a lot more, but let's do it. I'm in overtime now, and I gotta go. Okay, blessings and joy. Thank you.